This week on Inside Olympia, how is Washington State regulating the liquor and cannabis industries in an era of declining alcohol sales and market pressures in the marijuana industry? What's driving the market disruptions? Where are the tension points? On the program, Will Lukela, Executive Director of the Washington State Liquor and Cannabis Board, and Justin Nordhorn, the agency's Director of Policy and External Relations.
From the TVW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
Welcome to Inside Olympia. Alcohol and cannabis sales have been falling even as new products disrupt the market. Sales and revenues are just one example of market pressures amid concerns about consolidation, access to banking and capital, and public health and safety. This hour, we're going to delve deep into the current state of regulation and enforcement in the alcohol and cannabis industries. Joining me now, and for the full hour, is the Executive Director of the Washington State Liquor and Cannabis Board, Will Lukela, and joining him is Justin Nordhorn, the agency's Director of Policy and External Relations. Good to see you both. Thanks for being here.
Good to see you.
Will, good to have you back on the program. Justin, thanks for being here to help us along the way. You've a long tenure in the agency. So we'll be relying on your institutional knowledge. So we last spoke, Will, in October of 2024, and you were fairly new to the agency. You had been in Colorado, if I remember correctly, and there was a lot that we talked about at that time, including the state of cannabis tracing, a status of you were updating and modernizing systems and sort of how LCB operates kind of internally. You were building an internal research function and it brought on some PhDs. We talked about social equity and trying to make sure that people who had traditionally been prosecuted and when marijuana was illegal were having an opportunity to get into this marketplace in a legal fashion, and so on and so forth. High-potency THC products. As I mentioned that list, is there one that sort of jumps to mind today that is either in the accomplishment bucket or that's still very much front and center for this agency?
Sure. In the accomplishment bucket, I would say it's our systems modernization project. So we went live in March of 25, and it was online licensing. And it's been a challenging year as we roll it out, but definitely an accomplishment. It's going to speed up the way applications are accepted and processed.
What have been the challenges, and what are the users experiencing as they test this out?
Sure. So the initial challenges were just accessing the portal. And so we call it the portal, whether it's the sign-on challenges that come from whether it's wa.gov or just permissions. And just getting used to the portal when you come from a system where it's paper and then you transition into something more modern, there's a few hiccups.
What does it mean for your agency and staff, though, that you do now have a single portal and you can get off of paper and do this electronically? I'm thinking about, and we often talk about electronic medical records in the context of the Department of Corrections, or other examples of automating things or getting them kind of into a public disclosure commission, filing lobbying disclosure forms now electronically. Like, how much of a game changer is this in terms of just how kind of internal operations and the speed at which you can do things?
For a lot of the processes, it's streamlined quite a bit. Some of it is working through the database, but overall it's streamlining our operations. And so we look forward to being able to eventually build out the enforcement piece and add it into that same systems modernization project.
So how would that work?
So there'll be a case management system that we use separately from this system currently, and it's incorporating it so that we can have the majority of the agency's databases, all information in one place.
We'll come back to some of those other topics that we talked about, including traceability. But Justin, let me bring you into the conversation by asking you about the legislation that passed, and I believe it was last year, not this year, but it had to do with making it easier or trying to address what seemed to be a system that had evolved where we try to have a three-tier system with cannabis, and as I understand it, there were sort of marketing or agreements that were happening behind the scenes that perhaps were creating more of a captive marketplace, as I understand it. Can you help us understand sort of the problem that was identified and then the legislation that was passed in response to that?
Sure. So I believe you're talking about 5403. And basically the origin had to do with the maximum number of ownership you could do with a retailer. So we've always had it in, well, I shouldn't say we always, the legislature made a change several years ago that capped retail ownership at 5.
So that means you could have up to 5 dispensaries or
Correct. Yeah, so you were limited to 5. As a part of some of the legislation that came out, we also saw an opportunity to utilize management agreements. And so companies would come in and basically represent 10, 15, 20 stores even, and they would have the same type of operating plan. And so those were utilized to potentially gain more market than the 5 limitation. And so what this bill did is it's really supposed to be scaling that back down and saying, okay, you can only have 5. And so addressing that through the management agreements. And what was happening in some of the factors was basically you had better buying power with these management agreements. If you had 20 stores trying to buy product, you were getting better prices, those types of things. And so the small independent operators were struggling with that. So they went to the legislature and created the bill to remove some of the allowances around the management agreements. Now, it didn't fully remove it, but it did say if you're in a management agreement, you can only have 5 stores maximum, including if you own 5 stores. So whether you own it or just you have 5 stores under that management agreement, you're limited to that 5 now instead of having a little bit more broad-based.
Will, I'll ask you about this just in the context because it also gets at this social equity licensing issue, which has not gone away, and that is that the system, when it was started, was trying to avoid market concentration and trying to kind of cap the number of licenses that individuals could have, and you were either going to be a retailer or a processor or a grower. And then, I guess people are creative and clever, right? They came up with financial interest agreements. They created this sort of, quasi, I guess it was legal technically, but it was sort of this quasi ability to go around the law. And then, somebody started to cry foul. What is your understanding or thinking about sort of the pressures that exist here between consolidation, larger operator cannabis, large cannabis, or big cannabis, maybe we should say, versus small?
It's always a challenge. That's what I'm going to say, is making sure that the smaller operators have a place in the Washington state market is of grave concern to the board.
When I would imagine that the market pressures and the tides are probably pushing against that.
Absolutely.
Every day.
Absolutely, every day. And so it's a balance. It's a balancing act. And 5403 in its construct, I think, will hopefully help some, probably not all, but I think it'll help some in that.
Is there something more that's needed? Do you anticipate legislation to build on that law? Are there conversations about other steps that might be taken to rebalance this marketplace?
Yeah, I think I would say that, the law fairly clearly limited it to 5. However, when you're talking about the buying power issues where, a few large-scale players, dominated the market versus a smaller, really comes down to undue influence like we see in liquor. And so what we're trying to do through the rule set is address the undue influence and trade practice issues so that we don't see that expanding beyond. And what the legislation did is it basically called out if you have a financial interest, not necessarily straight up ownership, through 5 different activities, and one of them had to do with buying, then you would be counting towards that 5. And so there's been some confusion around that from people's interpretations, basically saying, well, this was meant for retail sales, but it's all under the producer-processor type of licenses. And for the retailer, I mean, it falls into there from the buying from a, basically a wholesaler aspect. And so the way that it's being looked at, there's some disagreement within the industry on what that really means. And so
What it really means under the new statute?
Correct, yes.
Can you say that today there is no longer an instance of a sort of entity that is managing purchasing for more than 5 stores, or are you still in the process of trying to implement and sort of enforce that?
So I think from that standpoint, everything is online and clear that you cannot do that for more than 5 stores.
And has anybody been found in violation at this point?
Not that I'm aware of. I believe there's still allegations that are out there, but not that I've heard of that there's been any type of corrective action for that.
If we step back, Will, and just talk about this this marketplace for legal recreational cannabis, 10 plus years now, with prices falling and kind of intense competitive pressures, how would you describe the current state of the market? How precarious are things? How many individuals are we seeing go out of business in any of the license arenas? What does it look like right now?
Well, I'm actually going to defer to Justin for some of the history because of how it was set up. And Justin and I actually had a conversation earlier today about what the state of Washington anticipated with regard to the licenses. And then we can follow up on the number of licenses that have either gone out of business or not.
Sure, and I guess the prompt for this is that the idea was we didn't want to oversaturate the market. We wanted to try to find some balance between supply and demand. We wanted to avoid consolidation. We wanted there to be equity. So 10 plus years on, especially with dropping prices, how would you sort of set this stage for where we're at?
Yeah, I think it's, the evolution definitely is challenging. I mean, the market, when you look at a standard business marketplace, typically you have more retailers than manufacturers, and we don't have that in the cannabis market.
Interesting. So is it the inverse then?
Correct, yeah. And so when we saw Initiative 502 come out, we had to do assessments at the time on what does this mean. And so we anticipated there would be 350 retailers because that's how many state liquor stores we had before privatization. And we thought if they can service the state, then that should be about the same number. And then we also anticipated only 100 producers and 100 processors. But part of the charge of the initiative was we needed to curb illicit market activity somehow. And so when we did our town hall meetings across the state, a lot of the small businesses who were engaging in this activity already said, don't leave the little guy out. We want to have a shot at participating. And so we made it much smaller in scale as far as how much you could grow, how many businesses you could own, those types of things. So we had put the cap as 3, limit of 3 retailers, 3 producers, 3 processors. And then later the legislature increased the retailer to 5. But basically, we saw this influx, and so we said, let's bring in everybody that we can into the regulated space. Well, that now in turn has this effect where we have more producers and processors than we have retailers, and so there's different market pressures being conducted with that, and the retailers have a lot of buying power and influence over pricing from the manufacturing side.
So they can then drive down the price. Yeah. So what is the solution, and is it to allow more retail licenses, and is that allowed? Would that be up to the legislature, or if you did that, would that then throw the market kind of into another kind of imbalance? Will, where do we go from here?
I'm conflicted, and I say conflicted because to add more retailers, so I came from an open market in Colorado.
And maybe you should explain what that meant.
Sure. So in the state of Colorado, there is not a cap at the state level for cannabis licenses. Any caps occur at the local level. And so they have a similar yet different problem. But from an economy standpoint, I think having more retailers would help. JLARC has made no secret, the state auditors have made no secret of the overabundance of cannabis. in the state of Washington. And while we acknowledge that there is an overproduction, when you look at it on a nationwide scale, it's less than some, more than others.
But do you believe that there's a market for that production if you could just have more retailers, or is the problem, in fact, that they're overproducing for demand?
I think it's a combination of both.
And are you seeing, and this is for either of you, licensees go out of business on a pretty regular basis on any of these categories, whether it's producers, processors, or retailers?
So I wouldn't say on a regular basis. Obviously, we've seen transition for retailers and producers and processors. Some sell their business to others, some just close shop. But we actually anticipated, similar to restaurant industry, that we would see a higher rate of turnover, and we haven't. And so a lot of folks have remained in business. We do hear frequently how difficult it is. And that they're almost failing type of messaging to us, but we haven't actually seen that higher volume of turnover that was initially anticipated, at least.
So just going back to our interview from a few years ago, Will, you talked about the social equity licensing effort being a meaningful but incomplete attempt to address harms associated with marijuana prohibition. And you called the initiative, efforts to sort of increase access to these social equity licenses a step in the right direction, but that there were barriers. So if you believe that there is room for more retailers and there's an interest in creating more, and I realize that not all the social equity license holders would be in the retail space, but what is keeping the state from expanding the number of retailers and in the process addressing some of the sort of pent-up demand for social equity licenses? Like, why couldn't you just go out tomorrow and say, we've got an extra 50 licenses available, and we're going to prioritize people who would fit the criteria for social equity?
Right. Well, first of all, it comes down to the board. And
So it is a decision of the Liquor and Cannabis
it's a decision of the
Board,
board.
not, you don't need the legislature.
Right. Because I think there is some, I may be wrong, but
Well, to expand and increase the number of licenses, we would need the legislature to come in. We're supposed to provide recommendations, though, so the board has this role to say, should we or should we not? And currently, right now, as we're seeing with the social equity applicants, the challenge is finding compliant locations because
and
we have so many restricted areas.
That's what you said
Right.
to me when
And-
we last
and
spoke.
finance.
That hasn't
And
changed.
finances.
Yeah.
Yep.
But are there, so maybe another way to ask the question is, right now, how many licenses are available, especially in the retail side, for social equity, qualified applicants?
I believe we have around 50. I think
You do. So there's available licenses.
Correct.
That's just interesting. So the issue is not the current cap. It's more these other barriers. And it's interesting you bring up the kind of local prohibitions, because this has been a real issue in California, where my sense is that their legalized regulated marketplaces really had a hard time getting off the ground because so many municipalities and localities have said no, and they've got a thriving illicit market. I don't know if you've studied the California sort of situation, but how would you compare, or how would you explain the barriers right now? Like, I don't have a clear sense of like how many cities in our state have either severely, capped the number of stores or just said no, or how that plays out across the state.
I want to say the number, don't hold me to it, is in the 70s.
Meaning
70
local governments.
Local governments either have some form of ban or moratorium in the state of Washington.
So that is very similar to California. So what are the solutions to this? If you've got these licenses available, you've got the potential applicants, in order to rebalance them, arguably to rebalance the marketplace, you need more retailers, and yet they can't find a place to set up shop or get the financing. What is the pathway out? What are those conversations like?
Well, some of what staff has been doing is reaching out to the local authorities. And staff spends a lot of time on the licensing side, doing presentations, meeting with city councils, county administrators, talking to them about cannabis, the cannabis market. And as a result, there's been some of the municipalities have allowed for cannabis.
Is that right? Have changed their minds?
They
and
have
pulled
changed
back
their minds, and so
moratoriums?
yeah. So we've had, I think when we talked the last time, it was less than 10 social equity licenses. Now we're up to 14, and it doesn't seem like a big number, but in the United States, and I think we talked about this during the last time we met, I said that it was probably one of the most successful social equity programs in the country that hasn't been fraught, knock on wood, with litigation and hasn't been halted from an injunction. And so we've got 14 licensees.
What would success look like? How many social equity licenses would you like to get to?
I would like to fill our social equity license quota in a perfect world.
And what is that?
It's 40.
Yeah, it's a little variable because, so in the latest bill, we had the 52 new licenses that the legislature said you can, bring those in. But we weren't at full capacity with what
Even
we had
before,
before.
yeah.
So, if we could, the ones that came into the mix with 2870 were anybody who was, canceled or forfeited their license, or, one of those reasons they didn't have a retailer license, and those got folded into the pool of social equity. So I think success for us would look like being able to fill the rest of the retailer allocated spots with the social equity folks.
And to be clear, those extra retailer, when the legislature did that, were those specifically only for social equity applicants?
Yes.
And when was that? What year was that?
That was 3 years ago, I believe. It was under
and is that
Senate Bill 5080.
Okay, and is that why you were saying that you've got the 50 roughly available?
Yes, yeah. And so, what Will was saying earlier is, the board has the decision-making authority over the producer processors. And so we don't need to go back to the legislature to ask for licensing from them. They also provided us an opportunity to bring in 100 processors and then 10 producer processors. But with the market the way it is, we want to be cautious with the producer processors because of, there's so much challenges for those folks. I think the processor, when we had our Whitney economic evaluation come in, the growth area was predominant for processors. For producers, they were very skeptical that they would have great success. So of course, we don't want to set anybody up to think, oh, if I apply, then I'm automatically going to be successful, because in the production space, that may not be the case. And so we have not opened up applications for those, only the retailers to this time.
Got it. Let me transition to another topic that factors into all of this in some respects and has been certainly in the news, and that is the federal rescheduling of cannabis, which began under the Biden administration. Maybe the one thing the Biden administration, the Trump administration kind of agreed on, because it started with Biden, it's continued and actually accelerated, I believe, with the Trump administration. And as of last month, the U.S. Department of Justice issued a final order moving state-licensed medical cannabis, specifically medical, not recreational, and FDA-approved marijuana products from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. This marks the most significant federal cannabis policy change since state legalization began. The April 26 order also launched an expedited federal proceeding to consider broader rescheduling of marijuana. What does this rescheduling, which we talked about when we last spoke, what does it mean, or what does it not mean for our regulated marketplace?
We're still searching for what it means. And so I think, what does it mean right now for our market? Not much. Not much. I will say that all of the jurisdictions are trying to get information from the Department of Justice to better understand impacts to the cannabis markets. And some of the rationale that we have here in Washington State, we've been talking about this internally probably, I don't know, feels like every day. And because of the way that the market was set up here in Washington State, poses some challenges with regard to this federal order.
How so?
And so You want to go into that, Justin?
Yes, so we have, of course, we've got a medical endorsement. So when in 2015, when the medical space came into the adult use space, all being sold out of the same stores, we did have an increase in licenses on the retail side, and so we have that capacity. But the statutory framework has always been around a recreational product. So we have some opportunities for those medically compliant sales to registered patients and those types of things that fall under the DOH purview for what's medically compliant. But the vast majority of sales are recreational, and so the way I-502 came to be didn't address the medical program, and so we don't have like independent designators like other states do.
And we don't have the medical dispensaries.
Correct.
It's all part of the
Correct.
regulated recreational marketplace.
But we do have some growers out there who specialize in medical product, and so they may only grow and process medically compliant product, but there's no designator on that. And so, they may be in the best position to be able to utilize the rescheduling, whereas other folks may not. And so, it's not really for the state of Washington to say whether they qualify or not, because the DEA permit's only issued by, DEA.
Would the rescheduling have a bigger impact in a state that hasn't legalized recreational or medical marijuana? Like where would this be having the most impact, do we think?
I would think the states that have medical-only programs are going to have the bigger impact.
And what would be the kind of results if by rescheduling? What changes if in a state with a medical-only program?
Sure. So some of those businesses, because it would be Schedule 3, would no longer be prohibited from utilizing the 280E tax exemption. And so they could be able to deduct business expenses and those types of things on their taxes, whereas under Schedule 1, you can't do that. And so I think that's one of the big benefits that those folks in the medical-only states are trying to move forward. Our folks would certainly like, our licensees would certainly like to capitalize on that as well. But the framework isn't very clear that, yes, we are medical-only. And like you said, the order did prohibit the recreational sales are still Schedule 1.
Just one last question on this. What do you make of this part of the order that involves an expedited federal proceeding to consider broader rescheduling of marijuana? Is there any thought that marijuana broadly will be rescheduled in the near future, which I would think would have pretty significant implications?
I agree with you. It would have significant implications if it got there. We're not there yet.
Not there yet. Okay, let's take a quick break. When we return, we continue our conversation with Will Lukela and Justin Nordhorn of the Liquor and Cannabis Board. Back right after this.
I hope that folks understand that we're deeply rooted in our communities. We care deeply for the communities that we work for, and we want to see the legal system work the way that it's supposed to, and the way that the Constitution expects it to.
How this is going to negatively impact public safety. There will be, breakdowns in the system, and I think when we talk to the public about it, it's going to scare them.
Watch all of TVW's award-winning shows on your time at tvw.org.
Welcome back to Inside Olympia. Joining me once again is Will Lukela, Executive Director of the Liquor and Cannabis Board, and Justin Nordhorn, the agency's Director of Public Policy and External Relations. Something else that we hear a lot about is the tax on recreational cannabis here. It's quite high. I would imagine that those in the business might be urging the legislature to reduce that, especially if this is a market that is already kind of fraught right now. Where do those conversations stand?
So there were some conversations during the last legislative session. None of those came to fruition. And we expect in the 27 session, there's going to be more conversations about.
Do you see them not coming to fruition because the state budget is kind of in tight times right now and that there's a reluctance to give up revenue? Or is there a sort of a policy reason or some other explanation for why that wouldn't be an easier conversation right now?
So I think during the past session, some of it was revenue. Some of it is a disagreement as to what the tax is and how to come to what the tax structure is.
By the way, it's a 37% excise tax
Yes, is so.
as compared to like a 10%
As a
sales
10%
tax.
sales
Yeah.
tax, correct. And so, is it a volume tax, similar to alcohol? I mean, what does it look like? And so, I don't know what your thoughts are, Justin.
Yeah, I think when we're looking at the tax pieces, sometimes it's difficult, and this may be oversimplifying it, but sometimes it's difficult to compare with other states. Other states have, income taxes, for example. We don't. So we have higher sin taxes in the state: alcohol, cannabis, tobacco. And so, comparing directly across doesn't necessarily capture the whole tax dynamic. 37% plus the 10% sales tax is definitely, a significant tax bill at the point of sale. And I think a lot of folks would like to see that come down, but, how that impacts the state, I'm not sure, what that's going to mean. We've seen some different proposals on tax ideas, on tax reform, if you will, but nothing has really developed from that, just because I don't think it's clear cut yet. So it's pretty difficult, and I think from a policy standpoint, I haven't heard necessarily opposition say, nope, we're totally opposed to changing the tax structure, but I also haven't heard anybody supporting it other than industry saying, hey, we've got some new tax ideas.
What is the status, as you understand it, of the illicit market right now? I did see a headline where there was this seizure. There was a large room, 12 vendor tables that were rented out to display and sell illicit products. This is from the Cannabis Equipment News site. So LCB investigators, in collaboration with Tacoma Police Department, went in and carried out a search warrant, and this happened in Tacoma. But are those sort of one-off situations, or is there a thriving illicit market out there right now?
I don't know that I'd say it's thriving. I'll say that, and I don't know that it's one-off either. I think it's in the middle. And so I can tell you that our Enforcement and Education Division works pretty closely with local law enforcement and works on these illicit operations.
Are there people saying that, and I realize we talked about prices have come down, but are people saying, is anybody making the argument that the total cost when you factor in the taxes is driving some consumers into the illicit market because it's just too expensive to go in the door of the dispensary? Or is that not the concern or argument right now?
I would say that there's arguments being made or suggested to that, but at the same time, some of the data that we see, like from the International Cannabis Policy Study, indicates that 86% of consumers in Washington are going through the legal market. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that they're buying all their product in the legal market, but we have a pretty strong majority of consumers purchasing from the legal market. So I would say that would need to be taken into consideration when we're looking at what the actual percentages would look like on how strong that illicit market sales are in the state.
And then at the beginning, I also talked about just the evolving offering of products in both the liquor and cannabis space. On the cannabis side, there is this trend of high potency or high THC products. When we last spoke, you were concerned about this. There's public health concerns. There's kids and whether they're getting access to this. What is the current state of play when it comes to, again, these sort of quote-unquote high potency or high THC products?
So I can talk about it from an enforcement posture. And it's not just the high potency THC piece, but also just cannabis in general. And so we still have about a 90% compliance rate for prohibiting of underage sales in the cannabis market. High potency THC is still a concern. It's still a concern. And during the past legislative session, there was some discussion, not as much as the session prior, about do you tax, I think we talked about in the last time we met, about taxing high potency THC, do you age gate it? Those conversations still continue.
What about banning it? What about saying, you can't exceed a certain percentage of THC in the product?
I personally don't know that we're there yet. I think that the conversations that we've been a part of, even with industry, have dealt with the age gating, the taxing.
And help us understand the age gating, because it's already illegal for someone under 21.
Sure. So the high-potency THC then would be sold to people age 25 and older.
What is the thinking about the 21 to 25s?
That the brain is more developed.
And that this, I mean, there's concerns about, is it triggering schizophrenia in people? Is it having sort of long-term health effects?
Yes.
Yeah. What are these products? What are we talking about for the uninitiated when we talk about high potency? What is that as compared to whatever else you might find on the shelves?
Sure, I think a lot of your standard product would be, flour, edibles, the infused, liquids and edibles, those types of things. The high potency THC may be your dabs, and so you're taking a very small quantity of wax or something like that, and if depending on how much you're consuming, of course, you're going to have those variable impacts. And I think it's more difficult to figure out the quantities when you're talking about some of those high THC levels. I think from a policy side of going back to your previous question, from the policy front, it's very challenging to figure out whether or not there should be any type of ban, because if you dry up the allowable product in the legal market, then you may drive illicit market sales. And so we have to be really cautious about how, what those potential ramifications are when we make those types of policy choices. So, the age gating may be a way to mitigate that. A full out ban, I'm not sure, is necessarily the best option.
The other thing that's in the news all over the country is states trying to figure out what to do about hemp-based THC products, which sort of roared onto the scene because of a change made in the federal farm bill a few years ago. Bills have been passing to regulate that in a number of states. The industry is really fighting to kind of keep their products. They say they want regulation, but they don't want to be regulated out of business. What is the status in this state? Because I'm just not hearing a lot about it.
Yeah, in our state, we passed a law several years ago that basically was, if you're selling any type of product with THC, detectable levels, this isn't even like 0.05 or 0.3% on a dry weight basis, for example.
Which was the trigger in the farm bill.
Yeah, exactly. So when you're looking at that, that's a higher level than just detectable. So anything that's detectable in a THC or in a product with THC, that has to be sold through our regulated market. That can't be sold in your, average grocery store, 7-Elevens, those types of locations across the state. It has to come through a cannabis market. And there's, to bring in product into the state, the only thing that the law allows to be brought into the regulated system is CBD, to be used as an additive. So the law is very strict on that, and then we have no detectable levels of THC. So in Washington, it's vastly illegal to have any hemp-derived product with THC in it be sold on the open market.
And what are you seeing in terms of compliance? Because it used to be, and I can't remember if it was here, but people were finding these products on convenience store shelves, and they were popping up, and then they were in competition with the regulated market. So of course that caused consternation. But since that law took effect, what's been the experience?
Well, I think overall we've seen it decrease significantly. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but the enforcement division still does some seizures when they see that out in different spaces, but predominantly we don't see that. I think the biggest challenge around the hemp-derived products is internet sales, because they're very difficult to enforce the internet type of distribution.
And then hemp beverages are kind of coming in vogue, and they're being marketed as alternatives to alcohol. And a lot of people, there's a kind of a movement. People are drinking less, consuming less alcohol. We've seen sales drop. And in some places, there's, you talk to the hemp beverage folks, they want to put their product on the beer truck that's delivering to the local grocery store or convenience store or other retailer that's outside the regulated cannabis environment, and let people choose that perhaps as an alternative to beer or wine or spirits. Is that possible here? What kinds of conversations are happening with the hemp beverage folks?
Yeah, as long as it doesn't have THC in the product.
But it
then-
does.
Yeah, then we wouldn't have that. So I know
So
that
you
there's-
can't even import that into the state, is what you were saying.
Correct, yeah. So, and looking at state law, so we also have some other provisions that manufacturers, not that they're talking about combining with alcohol, but you can't put any type of THC in alcoholic beverages. So you'd have to have them independent. So we would still need a change of state law in order to allow for those hemp-based beverages that are just THC
Well,
to be sold.
if the lobbyists haven't already arrived in the state, I imagine they will soon, because this is a burgeoning industry, and they very much are marketing it as an alternative. So is the pressure building? Are they coming to you yet and saying, hey, Washington is too strict?
They've come to us and asked a few questions, but nothing that's saying, hey, what are you going to do about this? I think when you look back at the legislation, the initial legislation to manage the hemp-derived THC products was agency request. And we were trying to find a solution to have the full spectrum hemp products, which would have some THC at very low levels in there, and that could have created space for those types of products. But the end result of the legislation was no detectable levels of THC.
Got it. The other, I just want to ask about this while it's on my mind. There was a bill that did not pass, if I'm correct, to regulate kratom, which is showing up on convenience store shelves. I don't even really understand what it is, but the bill was to propose a 95% tax on it and ban it for people under 21. This was a bill from Senator Saldana. Help us understand what kratom is, how it's showing up, and where things stand.
Sure. So we see a lot of kratom in convenience stores, unregulated, no age gates. It is an intoxicant. It's a plant-based product. There is some synthetics that are like 7-OH that are really potent, and those synthetic products are quite frankly the bigger concern than the baseline product itself. And so when we've talked about, or we've heard people talking about the legalization the regulation of kratom.
Is that how you say it?
It goes either way. I get told by staff that it's both ways.
You can tell I am clearly
but yeah, so there's
uninitiated on this one.
there's a push to regulate it, and there's a push sometimes to just age gate it. And one of the challenges for an organization like us is, okay, so you age gate it, who enforces that? Because in the bills before, there hasn't been any assignment of responsibility for agencies. So it's
Wouldn't it logically be the Liquor and Cannabis Board?
Well, that's what some people are saying, but without it put into statute, we have the legal authority to regulate cannabis, alcohol, tobacco, and vapor products. And so without that authority built into statute, we'd be like, no, it's not.
If we add the K to your acronym, does it make a good word or not? Okay. There was also a law that passed, I think this did pass, to allow some more flexibility with, I'm back to cannabis here, cannabis ads. They could be, this was a story in seattlered.com, they can get louder, brighter, more visible, expand what marijuana retailers are allowed to display outside their stores, effectively opening the door to more prominent advertising. And of course, the flip side concern is, does that further normalize cannabis culture? What about kids? What was the trade-off there in the thinking? Either one of you.
Okay. Well, so under that particular bill, the biggest issue had to be around trade names. And so folks, the previous regulations around advertising was you could have a 1,600 square inch sign, and you could have just 2 of them. And so your trade name was considered one of those, and folks are like, well, that's so limiting. So to mirror it with alcohol, it was increased to, you can have 4 advertising signs, but just like with alcohol, the trade names would not be considered one of those signs. And so what the result of this particular bill is you can have your trade names, which are just trade name only. They can be larger, governed by local government. So you'd have to meet whatever city ordinances or county codes for the size of those particular signs. We still control content, so it can't have, especially appealing to children. You can't have products, those types of things. But for trade names, they can be at different sizes. So you're seeing some of these that can be quite large, but it is a trade name sign. Whereas the rest of the advertising is still 1,600 square inches. It has to be affixed to the front entrance of the building or the front face of the building. And so the widespread proliferation, isn't necessarily there. I think you could see added billboards potentially. because that's also part of the bill, that the local jurisdictions, but really if the local community is okay with that, then it's up to them now to govern, whether they want those size of signs in their communities.
Is there, this also reminds me of the controversy over the packaging and naming of a lot of these products to look like common popular candies, for instance. And then, of course, there's the question of, they'll appeal to kids, or kids will get confused if somebody has that package. Where does that stand in terms of, regulating, cracking down on, or allowing it?
Well, that bill 5206, I believe it was, did not change any of that. So we still have the packaging and labeling controls, not especially appealing to children, those types of things. And so they can't do more.
Do you think
and
we're
expand
meeting the kind of public's expectation around that? Because, there are examples that I've seen where it does seem like stuff is made to look like popular candy, certainly.
Yeah, I think there's a mix of opinions about that. There's definitely been some concerns from folks. Sometimes when we're seeing product that ends up to a consumer, it's not necessarily from the regulated market. And so there is that point. There are folks who will go to another state, maybe they take it home, and then people see the packages. And I'm not saying that that's the vast majority of what we're seeing out there. But we approve all of the cannabis packaging for edibles in the state, and that's one way that we mitigate the risks of that. Flower, on the other hand, doesn't have that, but the way that you would advertise flower, I think, is slightly different than trying to mimic candy, since it is just a flower.
Going back to this, I'm bouncing around a little bit, but I failed to ask about the status of banking and capital access. We talked about it in the context of starting up a store, but banking's been a big issue. With the rescheduling, I presume if it's just for medical, it doesn't really change that. Is this still mostly an all-cash business? Is it hard for licensed cannabis business owners in this state to get banked?
I think it's getting easier. I think we're seeing some financial institutions that historically have not allowed cannabis transactions to allow them. And we hear more. I heard about another one a couple of weeks ago that
Are these FDIC?
they are.
So how and why is that happening? Because wasn't the hesitation by the banks historically was that they would run afoul of federal regulations?
Correct.
So what's changed to make them more open?
I was just as surprised as you are when I heard it, and so I've got staff that's looking into that because I'm curious as to exactly that question.
Do you think the federal rescheduling, even if it's not directly on point, has sort of sent a signal that maybe the federal government is...
Potentially. Yeah, potentially.
And then I also want to go back around to this question of the supply-demand differential. I did read at one point that we were producing 2 times, maybe 3 times the supply as the demand. Is that true? Is it currently?
So I don't think I could say definitively that that's the case. So we regulate by square foot of plant canopy that's allowable. And so not everybody is growing to maximum capacity. So it's difficult to really pinpoint what that is. And I know that there's been some reports out on how much growth and quantities that there's been, but there's also been some other elements of those that we actually don't track. And so what we track as far as plant canopy is the square footage of the grow space and not necessarily the back end yield as far as what the limitations are. So I do think that there's more production than consumption in the state. So I think that that's safe to say, but I don't know if it would be 3 times the amount.
So that leads really nicely, though, to my next question, which is about traceability, because I would think if you've got surplus product, that then there would be an incentive to try to find a market for it, even if it's not through the regulated marketplace. So one way you would avoid that happening, essentially product going out the back door, is to trace it. You and I spoke, Will, back in 2024 about the state of the cannabis traceability modernization effort. You said that the system that you're currently or were operating under at the time was built essentially as a contingency system, a stopgap between 2 other traceability systems. It became kind of the default. But you also said it could take years to stand up a new traceability system. So where do things stand on that front?
So what I'll say is we have CCRS, which is the system I was referring to. We still utilize CCRS. We still make improvements to CCRS under current budget constraints as we continue to look for the potential of a new traceability.
But you're not, there isn't something in the works at this point,
We've submitted decision packages. We're going on
which
what
is
our
like you're
second
asking
year.
for the money
Correct.
for the, but, okay, and it hasn't been, you don't have approval yet.
We haven't been able to.
So then what are the concerns or risks at this point, or what is happening in terms of potentially, and I'm not saying your traceability system isn't working, but is there what is the risk that excess product is going out the back door under the current system and current tracing system?
Well, I would think, just as before, there is a risk. I think there's always a risk when you're looking at if licensee can't sell the product, in the state, what are they going to do? People do desperate things, when they're not making that money. However, I think, when we look at, from a traceability standpoint, we have a reporting system, so the licensees are reporting, and that's what CCRS is, Central Cannabis Reporting System. And so we're monitoring that. Our enforcement team monitors that to see kind of where products are going, how much is grown. They also utilize that system for monitoring like pesticides. And so when you're talking about excess growth, sometimes, cannabis producers may actually be having some destruction that goes with that. Not all of the product that they are producing goes directly to market. And so you could have some of those types of elements that, maybe they had a contaminated product. They could have done a voluntary recall for that matter as well.
What would you say about product? I asked you about the packaging. What would you say about overall product safety, the testing, making sure it doesn't have mold, other things that could make people sick?
Well, I think we're doing a pretty decent job with that. We have some good tight regulations. We mirrored some of the other states like Oregon, for example. So I think overall product safety seems to be fairly in line with standards. We don't have a mandatory heavy metal testing in Washington, which we do have a rule petition for that we're reviewing at this point. But obviously with the medical compliant cannabis, you have to have that heavy metal testing as well. So we don't, at least from my experience and knowledge, I'm not getting a lot of complaints on product safety as it relates to that. And we monitor it pretty close too.
The research function that I know you were really excited about when we last spoke, again, 3 PhD level researchers who are standing up a research program, and you called it phenomenal. What are they doing? What's an example of an area of research that this unit is involved in?
Sure, and I'm actually going to turn this over to Justin because they work directly for Justin, and so.
Is there a particular, we have just a couple of minutes, but is there one example you could give
Yeah,
us?
so I would say that some of the work that they've been doing is creating some dashboards for data visibility and transparency for the agency. And we've also been creating a number, and you can see them all on the website, data briefs on a number of different topics related to the regulated products that we have. And so some of them are safety related, some of them are economic related. And so people will be able to go and actually get some considerable information based on the work that they've been doing.
Cannabis impaired driving remains a public safety concern. What can you say? I mean, I realize that's not the direct bailiwick of the agency. You're doing enforcement, but not that kind of enforcement. But how are you, as an agency, thinking about or contributing to conversations to reduce that?
Oh, we're having conversations with Washington State Patrol and the highways. It's first and foremost in our minds as we look at where technology goes with regard to testing, and more to come.
Okay. Just lastly, I think the fundamental question that I kind of like to come home with is, does the state still intend to preserve kind of its original vision for small operator cannabis, a model that's built around smaller operators? Or are we sort of tacitly allowing a more consolidated commercial structure to evolve 10 years on?
I'd say 10 years on with the limit of 5 stores, I'd say that we're erring more towards the stores, the smaller stores, and doing that, and not the commercialization.
What about in the other arenas, the producing, the processing?
Similar. I would say it's similar.
Okay. And if we talk again so we talked in 2024, it's 2026. If we talk again in 2 years, what do you want to be able to report as the executive director?
That we've got a new traceability system, that we have, we've migrated our enforcement data over into our systems modernization project, and that we're continuing to serve Washingtonians the way they need to be served.
Okay. Will Lukela, the executive director of the Liquor and Cannabis Board, thank you for coming in. Justin Nordhorn, thank you as well. Playing a very able assist here on a lot of topics. Good to talk with you both, important subjects. And thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We'll see you again next week.